Okay. Thank you very much. And again, like others, I'll thank Wade and Scott for taking the initiative to put this together. It's been a fascinating day so far, and I hope it is the start of a series of these initiatives. So well done for taking the initiative. I'm going to talk a bit about some work I've been doing, perhaps like Barb and Sean this morning kind of have backed into or inadvertently stepped into areas that are outside of my discipline. I'm an electrical engineer. My work is in the area of robotics, computer vision, machine learning. I've been doing that for about 25 years, much of it in collaboration with natural resource industries, but other sectors as well. And this morning the Minister mentioned a spin-off company from Memorial that had just received a big investment. They were 3 of my graduate students. So, I've always had an interest in seeing the work that we're doing have impact, particularly wherever I've lived, but much of that has been here in the province. Is this the advance the slide? Oh, I'm not sure what I'm using. The mouse didn't respond. I know. I've drifted away from it. Oh, it didn't. Oh, there we go. Okay. So I'm going to talk about 2 projects, I guess, for lack of a better description. One is a public review process looking at hydraulic fracturing. That was mentioned a couple of times today already in the context of Western Newfoundland. I chaired a panel along with 4 other academics, myself and Wade from Memorial, and then others points west of Newfoundland and Labrador. And we were given the task, and I'm not sure it was an enviable task, of conducting a public review and advising the Minister of Natural Resources on implications of hydraulic fracturing in Western Newfoundland. There's a large shale resource off the west coast. And unlike many of these panels, Steve mentioned this morning there have been a number of subnational panels that have undertaken this kind of exercise. We were specifically asked to advise or to make a recommendation about whether or not this type of innovation should be undertaken in the province or in Western Newfoundland. Many asked to provide advice on different elements of fracking. We were specifically asked to make a recommendation to government about go forward or not. Just to orient you to fracking, this is not going to be a technical presentation, but it's important to understand a little bit about the nature of fracking for some of the other things I'm going to say. On the left-hand side is a conventional oil well. Basically, oil is in a source rock. It migrates under pressure into a reservoir, and then a relatively small number of wells can extract the oil that's in that reservoir. So 150 million barrels of oil with a conventional well might take 5 or 6 wells to drain that level of resource. That same level of resource, because of the nature of fracking, which is actually trying to fracture rock to make oil flow in its source rock, and therefore there isn't a reservoir as such, and therefore the draining of oil is very local to the well, would take perhaps 400 or 500 wells. So it's and those wells are geographically distributed, whereas a conventional well would be, isolated, or wells would be in close proximity to one another. So as a development project or as an oil and gas project, one is extremely geographically dispersed, the other can be quite focused. So the exercise we were looking at is the unconventional fracking, the geographically dispersed. So we focused on issues most relevant to the health and well-being of the people of Newfoundland and the environment, as we were asked to do. We considered a lot of information, including 600 written submissions that came into the panel through a public consultation process. We committed to making everything public. We were under some pressure as a panel when we were first formed, skeptical about the composition of the panel, thought that some members of the panel, or maybe all of us, were somehow headed for an endorsement of this technology because of connections various of us have had with industry. And so in the first instance, we decided everything that we did had to be public, had to be open to the public, and therefore at the end of our process, people would understand how we arrived at our decision, and they would have full access to the information that we used to arrive at our decision. in the, as we went along in the process, the decision to go for a transparent process and make everything publicly available, in fact, facilitated the opportunity to use our process and the information in our process as a basis for further research, and that has happened. Not necessarily by members of the panel, but by other people with an interest in the topic. We conducted public consultation sessions. They ranged, that we did 4 of them. Perhaps the most interesting one was the one we held on the Port-au-Port Peninsula, which I could only describe as a cultural event. It had dancing, it had singing, it had poetry recitation, it had everything. We were attacked as a panel, and in the next minute we were served tea by the people who were attacking us. It was an experience I can't imagine I'll ever repeat. But people were passionately engaged. What was clear as we got into the process, and again I think Steve mentioned it this morning, the public doesn't really understand this technology. It doesn't stop you from having a strong opinion about it, but the level of understanding, there's a real deficit in understanding, and it raises, certainly raised for us the question of what is our role as a panel, as an academic panel or a group of academics on a panel. As we got into the process, we also decided, yes, we had to make a recommendation to the minister, but perhaps more importantly is that we could create a body of knowledge and create a final report that dealt with this issue in the context of Western Newfoundland in a way that it would be useful to the people of Western Newfoundland. And so that we set out as our own agenda as a panel. We were limited in our own expertise. I mean, the 5 of us on the panel had some expertise that was very relevant to the questions we were asked, but we didn't have it all. So we engaged other experts, many of them who were academics, many of them who were outside the province, to come in and look at issues, and provide us with substantive technical reports. But we asked each of them to do that in the context of Western Newfoundland. So I just don't need to know about seismic induced seismicity, right? Earthquakes. I need to know about that with some contextualization around Western Newfoundland. So we engaged people on that basis. So these are the list of experts we engaged. They included public health experts in the US who live in the middle of the Marcellus Shale area and who deal with issues of fracking daily. Chair in induced seismology out of the University of Calgary, through to, I see Roberto's here in the back of the room, folks in our own economics and other parts of Memorial to look at aspects where we had the capacity to, as a university, to provide the input to the panel. And I guess like academics are inclined to do, we also wanted to test our final report against a peer review. And so we engaged another set of individuals that we felt would bring an overarching perspective to the work. They weren't involved in writing any particular aspect of it. And we brought them in at toward the very end of the project to do, in effect, a peer review of it. There was another interesting dimension, I guess, of the panel's work that just came about by chance. We, early in our consultation process, we had the opportunity to meet with somebody who attended one of our early sessions, a PhD student who was studying at the University of Toronto, had a connection to the province, and with the consent of the other panel members, we invited her to just track the panel through our whole process. She could sit in on all the meetings. The only thing we asked is that you don't kind of preempt the panel's work, but you can come in, you can observe, and in the end, you can write whatever you like, comment however you like on how the panel functions. She is doing a PhD, or nearing the end now, I think, of a PhD around these type of consultation processes. So it was in some ways an interesting check for the panel. One of the things I think we did that was quite interesting to try and help the panel kind of come to grips with the issues that we were struggling with or were asked to deal with is we took a approach at developing a scenario. This wasn't a scenario that was proposed for the development in Western Newfoundland. In fact, there wasn't any particular proposal. There were proponents who had an interest in getting exploration licenses and doing some early work, but there wasn't any full proposal to consider. So we went and took public information and information that had been submitted to us, analogies from other parts of the world where there was production, primarily North America, information that was available through government sites like the community accounts, for instance, in the province. And we took that and developed our own full-scale scenario to see what it might mean if such a program were to roll forward. So just to orient you, you've seen maps of Newfoundland and Labrador. We're talking about the area on the west coast of the island of Newfoundland down towards the lower west coast. Port-au-Port Peninsula on the diagram on your left. The gray area is the Green Point Shale resource. The gray area represents the area where the oil has been found. You'll see in the inset to that image on the left, it intersects substantially with Grossmoran Park, and that was the flashpoint that probably led to the creation of the panel, which was a lot of public controversy that went national about the prospect of developing oil and gas resources in the park. But the real opportunity, I guess, or the near-term opportunity to develop the resource took place, or was proposed to take place down around Port-au-Port Bay, partly because in Port-au-Port Bay you had a lot of shore access, so you could put wells on shore, extend the wells out underneath into the bay, and recover the oil from onshore wells to offshore flow lines, if you like. The little diagram on the bottom right just shows how wells might be placed to provide full coverage of Port-au-Port Bay using extended reach drilling. So we costed this up and looked at not only the production cost, but how you might go about developing such a scenario. I won't go into the details, but that scenario led to 480 production wells being drilled from about 30 to 40 onshore pads. We looked at how much you could reasonably develop in the course of a year, so it would take 6 years to develop and complete all of these wells and get them into production. We looked at what would be associated with the development of these wells by way of how much water, sand, and chemicals and so on that would be used. We looked at how much of that would flow back, and that would create some of the environmental issues that people are concerned about. We looked at how long it would produce, which let us look at the economics of the projects. And in the end, it looked with a reasonable development scenario that we could take out about 150 million barrels, which might be the scale that would make it a project economically viable. So we used this to explore all kinds of issues. We looked at benefits. There was clearly an interest in this from the point of view of the prospect of employment, substantial belief that there was long-term employment. Certainly during construction, there was substantial employment in the region, in the province. There would actually been a lot of employment out of the province. A lot of the indirect employment with oil and gas is actually, surprisingly, in Ontario, the province that doesn't have any oil and gas production, probably provides about 20% of the employment to the oil and gas industry across the country by way of the supply chain. So, the benefits, particularly in the region that was going to be affected by development, the Port-au-Port, Stephenville area, were quite modest, both in terms of annual and, in terms of the capital phase of the project, the 6 years of development, and then the ongoing 20 years of operations. We looked at a number of other things, GDP and how money would flow and how money might be shared through various mechanisms to bring some of the royalties and tax benefits to the region. So this is just an example of a number of ways we looked at the project from a benefits perspective. We characterized the risks or issues arising that we explored in more detail according to really 3 categories. I've just put one of them up here, the socioeconomic issues. We also looked at environmental issues and health issues. But we looked at things like possible increased stress on the healthcare and social services systems in the region, impacts on other sectors of the economy, in particular given Grossmoran, looking at as we heard this morning, I guess it was Sean, I'm forgetting who was commenting, but the tourism, no, it wasn't Sean, sorry, apologies to whoever raised tourism, but tourism is a big deal out on the West Coast. The single biggest tourist attraction or tourist draw in the province is Grossmoran National Park, and in fact, Grossmoran National Park draws in as much as everything else combined. So Grossmoran National Park was right in the middle of it. So we considered in our modeling possible negative consequences and looked at how they might offset against the gains in employment from the fracking industry versus what might be lost in terms of for example, the tourism industry, and a whole range of other issues that came up, and we used this scenario to explore them. The geology was a factor that is quite different. The traditional thinking about fracking is that it takes place in a geology that's a layer cake. So the first picture I showed had nice layers of rock. There was the the source rock, and then there would be a cap rock over isolating the rock that you're fracturing from layers above, and therefore the gases and so on wouldn't migrate upwards. The geology of Western Newfoundland is as complicated perhaps as you can get. And so the little cartoon or the sketch on the bottom left shows, if you follow the series of blue lines that are kind of in the middle as you're on the far left, they are layers of the layers of rock where the resource will be found, several kilometers below sea level. And as you move to the right, you're actually moving on land on the island of Newfoundland. And so the rock that's at depth 3-4 kilometers when you're out in the middle of Port-au-Port Bay is actually up on the beach in Greenpoint, in Grossmorn Park, or just tangential to Grossmorn Park. And so the images on the pictures on the top show what those rock formations look like. And so the belief is, by the geologists, that what's at depth is likely to look like what's on the surface. And that's not a nice layer cake geology. It's fractured, it's faulted, it's folded. It's a complicated geology that may not mean the resource is that easy to get, even if it's there. And secondly, there could be certainly risks associated with the resource extraction that perhaps need to be looked at much more carefully than if it were a layer cake geology. The scale of operations, what I guess came across to us is that this was something that was completely lost and unknown in the region. People had been talking about fracturing a well, and people were exercised over the notion that there will be a well, you know, in tangential to Grossmorn Park. Nobody had really told them that an economic scale project would involve 480 wells at a minimum, and that would represent a huge disruptive construction project over numbers of years. So this is one well site that contains 10 wells in Pennsylvania. The image on the top left is when it's in operation. You can see a lot of land has been cleared. That's cleared because during construction, there's an awful lot of activity laying down all the pipes and all the equipment needed to put these wells in and complete them and fracture them and get them into production. On the lower right or the lower image is an image of what it looks like when you're building these sites. This is an aerial view of the same well pads that were in that last image in Pennsylvania, and you'll see that in this image there's something on the order of 10 different well pads. Each of them would have 10 wells. There's pipelines connecting all these wells. There's access roads. So there's a big land disturbance that's associated with this type of development, and it would extend all over the northeast or the north part of the Port-au-Port Peninsula to develop that level of, an economic level of oil and gas. So to put that in context, we then model what a construction project might look like. And so this is the Port-au-Port Peninsula. There's a small isthmus on the right-hand side, Stephenville, which was seen to be the service center, the largest community in the region, which would be likely the port that would be used, and so on, is off on the island. There's really two roads. One might be considered a major road, although it's a pretty small road. Route 460 along the south of the peninsula, and then smaller roads that run out to the points, Shoal Point and Long Point. And so we looked at what would a development mean if you were to truck the amount of water in and out and the amount of sand and chemicals and everything else that would go in now. Simply that issue. And each well requires over 3,300 truckloads of movement of things. You can double that because you're bringing stuff in, you're going to be bringing empty trucks out. So you've got a lot of trucks moving around what is an infrastructure that's not really well suited to it. If you boil it down through the development phase, the construction phase, you would have about 590 truck movements per day during construction. So a 10-hour day, if you said you were going to limit your construction to 10 hours a day, you've got a truck movement across the front of your house, 1 a minute. And these aren't little trucks, these are big trucks, tandem trucks carrying water and chemicals and so on. So we validated this with the petroleum industry, the company organization, umbrella organization that sort of does this sort of work. And, you know, they took some issue with our number. But to put it in perspective, does it get any better if it's one truck every 2 minutes, or one truck every 3 minutes, or one truck every 10 minutes? It, you know, unless you dramatically change the nature of how these systems are built, these fracking projects are undertaken, the number never gets acceptable. Now, for some people, it will never get acceptable. But on any basis, the idea that you're going to live for the next 6 years with a truck every 10 minutes going back and forth on the one road that's hardly fit for a car, let alone the trucks, was just not reasonable. Again, had never been discussed, had never been raised, wasn't on the radar of anybody really, the communities, the people out there. Our primary recommendation was that there were gaps and deficiencies that must be addressed before you could reasonably believe that there were appropriate conditions that would allow for fracking to proceed reasonably and responsibly, and that we suggested that recommended that the pause in proceeding with any applications would remain in effect, while there were 85 supplementary recommendations that we put in place. Some of these were showstopper or, you know, substantial. We traffic lighted the recommendations. The reds were the things that were go, no-go decisions for government. Things like, you know, the energy plan for the province was silent on this type of development. There was some reference, I think Kelly referenced regional economic boards. There were a series of regional economic development plans that were a bit dated, but they were the only things that existed that spoke to the aspiration of these regions. What was interesting is that for the regions that were affected in Western Newfoundland, the only one that spoke to the prospect of oil and gas development was actually the one that included Grossmorn Park, so go figure. But none of them spoke to oil and gas development. None of the others that were in the regions spoke to oil and gas development. So, you know, the issue of, you know, a development plan and reconciling this type of activity with other industries and plans for other industries was completely lacking. The geoscience was inadequate. There would need to be a substantial investment in geoscience. The infrastructure, the public infrastructure, both physical and things like support services, they were inadequate. There were no, particularly in the region most directly affected, there was no emergency plan that had been updated for numbers of years, and certainly there was nothing in that that could have contemplated this type of activity. So there were a number of very significant issues that government itself had to resolve before you could move on. If you got beyond those, then obviously there were a number of other, we recommended a health impact assessment be part of, in addition to an environmental impact assessment would need to be taken place. Anyway, there was a whole range of things that might flow from, you know, getting the red light recommendations handled. Government is working through them, I understand. I've been engaged a number of times since the panel reported. So they're obviously taking the report seriously. They haven't lifted the ban or the pause, and I don't know if they ever will. Just to back to, I was reminded of this just the other day because I got an email, and I'm not sure if Wade sent it out, but Roberto, who's at the back, just recently in Energy Economics Journal, some of the work that he did for us, or a paper based on the work that he did for the panel, resulted in a recent publication. And I know of 2 or 3 other papers that are in some level of development, not by members of the panel, but by others who were engaged or around the process. So that was an experience, I guess, that just came, for me, that came about by chance. I was asked to become involved in this. I brought some understanding, I guess, of the oil and gas industry through my own research activity. Through this process, I developed both an interest and an appreciation in the broader implications of these kind of innovations, and the excitement, for lack of a better term, of working in an interdisciplinary team, engaging with real experts in other disciplines around this topic, taking the personal challenge of just coming up to speed on these, and then as a panel being in a position to put forward to government on one hand, but the proponents on the other. I guess there's more than 3 hands, and then the groups that were concerned, the community groups, to put forward and explain our recommendations in a way that at least was seen as credible by the various players. But fracking is probably not the most significant issue facing the oil and gas industry in this province or anywhere. And my own area, as I said, is in digitalization, machine learning, robotics, the technologies that are appearing everywhere. This is just an example of some views on how it's going to affect the oil and gas industry. And it will affect the oil and gas industry in this region, I think, in ways that really haven't been contemplated. And so I spent 2 years on sabbatical at the University of Toronto at the Monk School. Through the course of that, we developed a project looking at the effects of digitalization. It's translated into an opportunity going forward that's just been supported by the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research, CFAR, in one of their new programs looking at innovation and future prosperity. And our oil and gas focused case study will be a significant component of that. So I'll just, in a few slides, just give you a sense of what that's about. So offshore oil and gas in the digital age is going to be a very different operation than it is today. But today there's offshore platforms, lots of people on them, lots of movement back and forth to them. The small number of people, a relatively small number of people on the platform are actually engaged in the production of oil and gas, and many more that are out there are supporting the people who are engaged in the production of oil and gas. Moving forward, and the project that's next, I guess everybody's hoping, anybody who is hoping there's going to be a next project, is looking at the Beta Nor development, which is deep water, further out, presents some logistical challenges that business as usual or status quo approaches won't allow it to be developed. Equinor are a company that's very technologically innovative, a Norwegian company. They have subsea factories operating in Norway, meaning basically all of the production operations sit on the seabed. There's nobody out there. They can be run remotely from adjacent platforms or from onshore. Where there are people involved, they are in remote integrated operations centers. So they're sitting in their offices or sitting in boardrooms. They're not flying back and forth by helicopter. There's a small number of people who would be associated with going out to the site. They would be engaging with digital technologies. There would be drones. There would be wearable computing. So it will, the digital technology will fundamentally change the nature, extent of work, the nature of work, and the type of individual or skill set that will be needed by the workers. So we're exploring that in the context of this project. In recent years, there's been a lot of popular press playing around the future of work. Much of it comes out of work that was done out of the University of Oxford by Frey and Osborne. The image on the lower left looks at the probability of, they call it computerization, but it's automation, both physical and cognitive, replacement of what people do. On the far right of that image is, or on the far right of that graph, are the occupations that are thought to have high probability over the next decade of being fully automated. And if you look at what they are many of the occupations that you'd associate with resource sector activities. Not all, but substantial amount of it. The work from Oxford was put in a Canadian context by the Brookfield Institute in Toronto, and they reported that nearly half of Canada's work activities could be automated. This is just practically, it's possible to replace physically or cognitively with a computer what is done. There may be other reasons why that mitigate against that happening, but from purely a task perspective, it's possible. The communities most susceptible tend to have smaller populations with an outsized share of manufacturing or natural resource jobs. And when you look in the details of the report, they're rural places. An effort by, in this case, Suncor to automate some trucks in Western Canada produced an awful lot of angst over a couple of day period last year. And that represents less than 1% of their workforce. So when you're talking about 20 or 30% impacts, you're talking about an awful lot of people. The opportunities and challenges of digitalization are many. Barb mentioned about worker safety in terms of her her interests in safety net. Certainly, the technologies have the prospect of increasing worker safety. If you don't have to get on a helicopter to fly to a rig, and you can, do your work from a boardroom down on Water Street here in St. John's, certainly there's an advantage. You get to go home at night. If you have wearable technology that's monitoring your position and monitoring your heart rate and monitoring, all kinds of, bio data, there's the prospect that that's actually able to keep you safer. It can detect if you fall. It knows if you've fallen where you are. But it also raises the prospect of surveillance. It allows people to be monitoring what you're doing where you are. So there is a potential consequence to all of that, a negative one that perhaps needs to be at least understood. I won't go into all, maybe the opportunities of this technology are all self-evident. Certainly, if you can reduce your costs and you can shorten the time to get into production, there are very substantial royalty impacts, positive flow of money, substantial amounts of money to the governments. The royalty regimes for oil and gas, offshore oil and gas, are quite rich. To date, though, those have been, Wade can probably, may or may not share the perspective, but I think to date, those royalties have been given up to some extent in favor of perhaps less efficiency in jobs and perhaps some jobs that might otherwise be replaced by machines. So it's jobs versus royalties, and it's one or the other. And in some cases, the royalties might be more lucrative. You could probably buy out all the jobs and maybe diversify with the royalties rather than simply doing something that might otherwise be done better or differently with technology. But for sure, there's an impact on the employment and the nature of work. It may not all disappear, probably not all going to disappear, but it will change where it happens. And once you can move your operators off a rig to downtown St. John's, you can move them to Stavanger, you can move them to Houston, you can move them anywhere. So the location or the jurisdiction with the most digitally savvy workforce will probably get a disproportionate share of this kind of work globally. And so there's this decoupling of the location of work from the site of work, or site of work, sorry, from the ultimately the end point of where that work impacts, is now possible with these kind of technologies. And I think that forces a change in how governments need to think about the value proposition. It can't just be about trying to hang on to truck driving or construction or these kind of jobs. It's got to focus on figuring out a way to build a higher end in some substantive way that allows a place like St. John's to become a global center for something. And that's going to require and challenge us as universities to have education in place to facilitate that kind of advantage for this place. So the relationships get much more complex. How do you come to grips with all of that? And this is my last slide. I think I'm down to, maybe I'm just over time by a minute, so I'll end on this. What we're trying to do is go back to something that was kind of this, something like the approach we took in the fracking. We took a model. We used the model to explore different aspects of the issue. So here we're building, and Wade is very directly involved with me on this, we're building a model for the regional sector. So we can pull into that a series of projects, scenarios, with different royalty regimes and different tax models. We can put these in, look at how ready we are on a number of different digital readiness levels, see how that affects the overall economics of the project, and in turn look at how that spins out into the returns for the company and then into the returns to the province by way of royalties, jobs. Timing of jobs now are probably better than jobs in the future, so if you can expedite projects and so on. So the digital piece is that as we look at the effects of digitalization, and we've mapped the oil and gas life cycle in a lot of detail, we can go back in and say, well, if you could, through a digital intervention, improve your success rate in exploration, which will have a direct impact on the expected monetary value that the companies will see, may not have any effect directly on employment Nobody will lose a job by improving your success rate in exploration. But it may raise the confidence of the industry to go and do some more drilling. It may let them, in fact, rather than drilling 3 dry holes as Chevron did, it may let you have success on the second hole and therefore have a project. It may allow you to have projects that are marginal become sanctioned and economic. And while on any one project you might have only 75% of the employment that you would have had in the old days, the fact that you have more activity means that you actually have, and you've kept yourself whole, or in fact probably have improved the job opportunities. The technologies are not unique to oil and gas. Right? The technologies that we're talking about, big data analytics, machine learning, these are the technologies that every industry is looking for talent in. And so I think the issue, and back to something maybe Sean mentioned in response to Wade, the oil and gas industry in this province represents something in the near term, something substantial in the near term. Who knows how long it will be an opportunity. But there is an opportunity to build a workforce that has mobility outside of that workforce, and to have resources, if the revenues both can be increased and used a bit better than we've done, can be used to diversify and provide different opportunities. Perhaps another Verafin, perhaps another billion-dollar company that in fact spun out of the resource sector. FinTech that spun out of resource industries. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Dr. Gosine. Our next presenter is Dr. Alvin Sims. He is a faculty member in the Department of Geography at Memorial and a research leader at the Harris Center's Regional Analytics Lab. And he's got a long title here. On purpose. It is Developing and Applying Geospatial Hybrid Demographic and Economic Supply Chain Models, a Systems Approach for Computing Regional Economic Impacts and Profiles. Please welcome Alvin Sims.
Good afternoon. It's been a long day, and I just realized we've been here since 8 o'clock this morning. And so what I'm going to talk about today actually is a process, and I deliberately made the title long, and because if you look at it on the surface, it's got nothing to do with engagement. It's got nothing to do with transferring information and working with local councils or stakeholders and so on, but actually it evolved from that process. Oops, got me started. There we go. Basically about, I can't remember now, 5 or 8 years ago, myself and Rob Greenwood and David Frischwater from University of Kentucky, and at that time, he was the director for rural development at the OECD, and we wanted a mechanism, if you will, to advance research and actually look at providing information for policy-based development and evidence-based development, sort of thing. And actually, in the early stages of all this, I guess it all came from, I remember when I was a grad student in Edmonton at the time, I had to read a big, thick book by Walter Eisert on methods of regional analysis. And I can tell you it's about 600 pages, and it will put you to sleep. And more recently, I met Dr. William Schaefer from the Georgia Institute of Technology School of Economics, who was a big leader in developing regional impact models. And of course, we did a lot of consultation in our process with them, and also with Stats Canada and so on. So what have we done? Well, I just put a list of things that we've been involved with, a selected list, if you will. And I said, as I was typing this up, I said, gee, there's not enough pages to put this on at this point in time. But it also shows that at the end of the day, that we evolve partnerships, both municipalities, with organizations like the Canadian Business Development Corporation, with government, and so on. And we actually, at the moment, are working throughout Atlantic Canada. What we spend a lot of time doing, and hiding away in dark rooms, as someone told me one time, and developing what we call a geospatial supply chain and regional economic analytics model, which is a mouthful. But basically what it does, we develop something, and I'm not going to say it's purely artificial intelligence, sort of thing, but it's in there. And basically what we do is we want to have a predictive reaction to information as opposed to just a reactive sort of approach, whereby if you're reacting to something, it's already happened. So what we want to be able to do is provide tools and abilities, to, especially to communities and municipalities and other stakeholders, so that they can actually look at what should we be planning for given what's happening around us, you know, sort of thing. It's what we've done is totally modular. Basically, any level of geography, and the geography is determined by our level of data, which I'll get into shortly. And everything that we do follows acceptable practices because we cannot violate certain assumptions and concepts and so on. And we kept our standards to those of Statistics Canada simply because we've amassed at this moment 20 years of time series data has been standardized from 2000, I think, up to 2019 at this point in time. And so, and that takes, that in itself is an effort. And so what do we do? And I'm not going to talk about, you know, sort of thing, the engine, if you will, but the type of things that we do, we look at impacts of adding or removing industries from a regional economy, forecasting the impact of population changes that could have anything to do with public services, healthcare, housing, and so on. We have actually, with David Freshwater, University of Kentucky, developed a module looking at labor force demand and supply issues and skill occupation mismatches and how can you transfer, or like, for example, we noticed in some of our analytics lately that there's going to be a shortage for workers, that low-skilled workers in D-level occupations, which are mostly in the service sector. And the issue is we're going to have a surplus of B-level skills or college, university-educated people. Who's going to fill those other jobs? And will you downskill to work in those sectors in the economy, which is a big question. Of course, we have our industry transportation geospatial supply chain analysis, which basically looks at the economy. And I should point out that what we do when we run our model, and just to geek out a bit, we deal with every interaction, transaction between every business, organization, and so on for every place in the province and every industry and every commodity at the same time. And we initialize our model. I think we got something like 1 billion transactions. By the time we're done of doing all our analytics, we're up into 3 or 4 trillion transactions in the model. I mean, that gives you an idea about the volume of information that's ticked through as we do this, and combinations, of course. The idea of what we want to do is that one of the things that drove us for this development really was sometimes you would go into a government administrative database and you would see suppression on economic data. You would see certain suppression because the community size was small or for some other reason or whatever. And that sort of became frustrating because we would have sometimes individual small communities saying, we're thinking about doing this, is that a good option for us? And we could not truly give an answer by using provincial level numbers and stuff like this to put things out. So basically, you know, sort of thing, what we do is for this, although we develop the engines, and sometimes we develop modules because the community asks for certain things that we didn't think about, but it is community participation when collecting data, and we try to establish local ownership of the data and outcomes, and this is where we're headed with these sorts of things. So how do we get local data? And that is where participation, I can tell you, is sometimes it's very difficult. And we're involved in a project at the moment where we requested business lists from every municipality that we were involved with. And we requested that in May, and 4 or 5 months later, we finally got all our lists, you know, sort of thing. And some of them are really good. Where possible, where we need some fill-ins, we do a one-page business survey that through participation with the municipalities, they administer it for us. And we did a project in Bonavista. Vista. We got over 350 local businesses with exact locations, with a number of employees, whether it's seasonal, non-seasonal, and we're able to classify it at that level. And we did something in Bonavista Vista North that was similar, you know, sort of thing. So basically, what we end up doing, the kind of coverage that we got, we're now able to, for example, produce a map like this that's showing all the locations that we've sampled in the province, and we combine that with tax filer database, census data, stuff from government portals, Newfoundland community accounts and Alton's here, he knows where all that comes from. And basically business lists for municipalities. We even buy sometimes, and actually we stopped doing that because we found our data, what we got was better than what they were doing, like Scott's business directory and stuff like this, which is actually, sometimes money not well spent. And soon as new data become available, our databases are updated. And we've got the interface and the tools to do that. And if you see, is there a pointer on that? No. Anyways, if you see like Happy Valley Goose Bay there, sort of thing, these are actual locations of all the businesses in Happy Valley Goose Bay. And actually they participated. They had their GIS person provide us with a business list database, and we have all the information. We standardized that to 6-digit NAT codes, or North American Industry Codes for those not familiar with that. And for example, down below here, we got Bonavista. And for example, it's some sort of lumber company. It tells us how many seasonal employees it got, how many full-time, and so on and so forth. And we got it sort of for Bayvert, Roddington, and we got it, we can, do it pretty well for almost anywhere that we have. So, but basically it's through local knowledge, engagement, and we try to get place-based data to supplement all the other data. And what we actually do then, we have an algorithm that compares all these data to each other and see where there's misses and agreements and so on. And one thing we found out, there are a lot of small businesses and communities that don't pay a tax at the federal level because they don't have enough income, and they're not listed in the PACS business database, so that fills a gap as well. Sort of thing. As Mark Brown from Stats Canada said, he said, you guys are insane down there. I see, but, sort of thing. It is the precursor to what people call crowdsourcing or whatever, but we do it at a bit more formal level, where we try to keep things standardized so we can actually compare things over time. So what do we end up getting? What we end up doing really by being able to do this, we actually use for the economists in the room, we use a technology matrix from the input-output tables to drive the technology for what we need to look at. Everything else comes from our models, from our employment data, from what we know about output from these sectors in the economy and stuff like this. And what you see over here is the flows or the value chains between Newfoundland and Atlantic Canada. And by the way, just in case, I want to fill this up, for example, because of computational intensity at this point in time, imports are just, are distributed throughout the area, but exports are shift off, like we can actually identify where exports go because we got some data from Transport Canada, like we know where things come and go for, because when we did a project for them. And so basically the other one is the commodity flows, St. John's commodity flows, Newfoundland trade, both directions, all industries. But the interesting thing that came up about this, I'm just trying to, here it is. When you look at commodity flows and you want to look at peripheral areas within an economy and how things come out, all these little communities here, they end up like the Gulses and the McCallums and other places there because there's not very many commodities going into those communities. And so one of the things that we actually do is we data mine that very complex supply chain to look at, like clusters of industries, are they dispersed or concentrated, sort of thing and so on. So the one for the province is just, a whole different. And then we can actually go down, because we have all that local data, we can do place-based, single industry commodity flows and so on and interactions. And from that, we can look at local economic indicators, labor market needs, because we've linked up industries and scale requirements and occupations and education and so on and so forth. And that links into population dynamics and housing and so on, and final demand, like induced type of things. So once we get that done, we can actually, as I say, data mine that supply chain, and we know the value of output. Like, for example, here, like the way this interactive tool that's going to be online in the future, if you zoom out, you get the total value of the economy. If you zoom in, you start seeing the local sort of distributions, sort of thing of the value of the economy and so on, in a certain sector and so on. But again, it's so much that you've got to use that local data, because what we find is that there are a lot of holding companies in Paradise that are actually fishing boats, or slipper skippers you want to call them. They're probably fishing in Point Leamington, sort of thing. So it's kind of an interesting little thing there. The other thing that we've done, and because that demand came from other things that we've been working on, like housing demands for Northeast Avalon based on growth in the economy and stuff like this, is that we've integrated this with a demographic model. And basically, what we do, we take the data from Stats Canada and Census and so on, but the single age data, not the cohorts, because as you group things and average them, you get roundings and stuff like this that sometimes cause issue. We have a flexible geography, so in any way you want to organize the geography, we can do the projections for. We're using sort of an agent-based approach, and we have propensities for birth, deaths, education, and education is level times your field of study. Migration components we have in there, we have intra versus interprovincial, international migration, and we assign this to individuals. So if you're in a small community like Altus and you don't have a high school education and you're 55 years old, the likelihood of you moving out is going to be pretty slim. But if you're 18 with a grade 12 education, you're likely to go away, and so on and so forth. The reason why we developed this model, and as Alton will attest to, I mean, the issues around population estimates and looking at this in terms of labor markets and stuff like this, is because of small data issues. There's one thing that we do with this model. We can add up those numbers and we will get the provincial population. As a matter of fact, Stats Canada came out with the recent future populations for the province. And by the way, 3 years ago, we predicted those numbers pretty close to within 0.05% of what they got. And we found the difference that they had is that we didn't see fertility rates increasing, but they were increasing by a basis point almost, you know, sort of thing. And that was the difference in the model. So we actually pay due diligence to what we do. And, but the biggest issue that we have is migration scenarios. And the only problem with that is that we trained that on 20 years of data, and we had to estimate the certainty of projection using standard error, because within our economy, if things are not growing and there's uncertainty, well, then there's a retention issue, and that retention issue gets reflected in what you can forecast about who's going to stay and who's going to go. And as you see here, for example, stuff that we've been working with Dr. Parfrey and his group on, looking at some things. This is the Northeast Avalon Urban Core, and it looks like, you know, pretty solid. The blue line would be the worst case scenario, almost nothing ever happens. You know, you just go the way you're going. But if things pick up and certain events happen, like, you know, certain events happen, you know, you got growth, well, you get the red line, you know, sort of your best case scenario. What you will notice with the Northeast Avalon is that band is very close and that error is very, very compact, because there is growth potential here. If you look at the Eastern Outboard, excluding the urban areas, you get sort of a big wide band like this, because there's a lot more risk and out-migration in those areas. And by the way, we did studies on the Burin Peninsula, just of interest, quite a few years ago, and we were projecting on average 4 or 5% decline between census periods and stuff, and that's been holding true. And in other parts of the province, that is all true. And we can contextualize those scenarios and stuff like in terms of education, occupations, and so on. Scale is important when doing this. As you know, someone said, oh, we grew by 1% at this rate, this period in the province, but locally you could grow by 10% or decrease by 10%. So we sort of pay attention to that. So this is, for example, for the Eastern Alf population estimates, what are there. And as I say, once you include the uncertainties, guess what's group between the 30 and 35-year-olds has the highest degree of uncertainty, because they're the most mobile. So if there's no opportunities for them, they're going to leave. Like last year, when actually it was in August or September, I'm not sure, Alton, when the migration data came out for the year, we had a net loss of 3,000. They were all 25 to 35. 1,200 or so went to Nova Scotia, because a lot of opportunities in Halifax right now. Some went to Ontario, some went to Alberta. But what they were our trained, educated young people that were mobile, you know, sort of thing. One thing that will happen, and of course we have this for everything here, and you see the uncertainty that occurs when this is occurring here. But you look at this part of the band, it's very narrow, and we well increased in aging. So one of the things we got to look at is that what are the impacts of that short-term aging period that's going to last for a certain period of time. And by the way, this is up to 2025 we got here for that scenario at the moment. So basically, it's big data. We've designed our analytics to sort of include a lot of different variety of data. We have volume. We have velocity, the analysis of data flow. Our poor computers are actually at its maximum at the moment. We're trying to get on a cloud. It's already been designed for that. But if you look at what we do, this is the things, and we're very focused on what we do, but they're the spin-offs from when you generate information about local economies. And of course, what we've done is web and cloud ready, and basically at the end of the day, sort of thing, we link everything all together, either by geography or by occupation and industry and skills and stuff like this or whatever that's there. So the idea, the goals are very simple. Local assets, business geospatial databases, we got an inventory, we do our analytics, we produce information. And the idea is that what we want this to happen is to have evidence-based analysis for regional economic planning development. And as a matter of fact, one of our most recent projects just got peer-reviewed, not by academics yesterday, but by 6 municipalities that we supplied information to. And they did a peer review about how useful was that information for them in planning going forward. Yes, we do publish and whatever, but a high proportion, I would say 70% of what we produce ends up in reports or sessions with at the municipal level or at the town level or whatever. So our process is this. Normally we work with municipalities and other organizations, whatever, and basically we want to engage at this point in one of our projects, say with community clusters. But what we actually do is that we make those people that are going to want to be a part of this, they got to do a submission and tell us what type of information they need. What are their concerns? And we take that information and we break it down into what type of analytics that we can do to answer those questions. So it's almost like a designer output, if you will, for what is needed at each municipal level, sort of thing. And, one of the things is these are partnerships that include single municipalities. We've done stuff for Transport Canada, federal government, COA, and so on, Department of Health, as well as local business and entrepreneurs. I got a call from the town of Mulgrave in Nova Scotia just recently, and they want to do something because they're in a place where they're in a place of intervening opportunities, but they're not getting the opportunities. Sort of near Port Oxbury, and then near Cancel, and so on. So we sort of spread that out. We do have startup meetings with our partners. We either go on the ground, and I think my car has got the mileage to prove it. We cover pretty well every place in the province, including in Newfoundland and Labrador. We maintain regular contact. We have a social media thing set up between us where we're always asking questions, and they give us feedback. We give them feedback. We have post-analysis meetings where we got workshops. We want to make sure that they understand the analysis. They know how the information can be integrated into their planning process, and they know how it can be used to foster greater economic development collaboration within their region. And one thing that we started out with Kelly Vaughan and so on about probably is over 10 years ago now, I think, Kelly, I just forgot the time. But actually, at the end of the day, you go to places now, people talk about regions, sort of thing and stuff. So, the education process is a long-term thing. We're also now looking at, we're going to work with a private company. We're going to develop some web applications where all our tools will be available to these communities and to whoever needs them and so on, that can get updated information, run analysis. If a company comes to your town and say, we're going to create 500 jobs, the economic multiplier is going to be for every dollar we put in, we put $1.60 back into your economy. Well, they'll be able to come back and say, well, from our analysis, that's not quite true. And I was at a symposium in University of Waterloo with the Rural Ontario Institute. I was invited up there, and the issue is that people always overestimate local impacts when they bring in new industries into rural areas, and sort of thing. And the issue is because there is a lack of a lot of local microdata that could actually drive those results and give you better outcomes. Like what we go to the reports, for example, there's a lot of difference between regions. A lot of focus, no surprise, in rural Newfoundland demography, housing, schooling enrollment, housing access in Abbey Valley Goose Bay, for example, for young people is one thing, access to health care, consumer spending, workforce availability, immigration, all these other things. Identify opportunities for shared economic development, sort of thing, impacts of proposed initiatives. And what I mean by that, they got an idea. Should they go forward with it, or is it something that's out of their reach, or what do they have to do to meet those requirements to be able to take something forward? And of course, they want local data. So I'll just give some examples of outputs very quickly, sort of thing. The big challenge comes is, the economists in the room, and I say to an economist, we calculate both forward and backward multipliers, so they'll know what we're talking about. And there's no point writing up a report talking about this kind of information, sort of thing in that context. So what we do is that we break it down. So we talk about, say, a backward multiplier, local supply, what is available locally, local market is who buys your stuff after you make it, sort of thing. And we end up producing summary information. And this is just an example of some prototypes that we're doing. And I don't know if you can see it here, but like, for example, here it tells you seafood product preparation, sort of thing is 17% of the local GDP. The local supply to get, of all their transactions, they get 65% locally of all their transactions. And I should point out, source for indicators are always available. And then at the market level, once they finish their production, things that they need like trucking and other stuff, they get 82% of it. But the important thing is the supply index and the market index, that is, there is proportion of transactions in the economy, sort of thing, when it's buying and producing things and whatever. And we put in initially things like strong and weak and stuff like this, which is above average, sort of thing, your X number of units above average, it'll be very strong, and so on and so forth, because they didn't want to be dealing with, all these kind of numbers initially, sort of thing. And if you go down, like, for example, one of the things that's interesting, fishing, for example, only 28% of local supply, because most of the thing that you need to go out catch fish is fuel, which is not produced locally, and so the benefit is a bit less. The technology they need, their sonars, their nets, and a lot of other stuff is probably brought in, most likely brought in from somewhere else. But their big benefit, which I'm always a proponent for, is that at the local market side, who buys the fish, like the fish plants and so on, they're realizing 89% of their potential spin-off, which is actually pretty high. And of course, if you look at something in final demands, for example, like residential construction, you see that they got 40% local supply, but 0 on local market. But that's pretty common to outputs that are final demand. There's no more benefit. You buy a house, you build a house, you sell it, that's it. And then there's a whole different spin-off from the people who live in the house, because that's a whole different stream. And then, data from local surveys, for example, we did this project in Bonavista Vista North, and we were able to identify from that, the producer markets, whether it's exports, the rest of Newfoundland or locally and so on, and consumer sources, where do you buy your stuff? And what is killing a lot of rural communities is that people are buying at the Costco's or going to the large box stores in nearby communities or larger centers. And basically, we see an eroding of retail trade in those smaller areas because of that. And the other thing, of course, when we compare what they said, for example, their market locations according to the survey, according to a supply chain model, they're pretty close to each other, but sometimes they overestimate or underestimate those kind of numbers. And put it in context, you take that same data and you look at the supply chain and you look at the value of the impact. And for the geek out, for you guys who know how to calculate in pairwise comparison eigenvectors to look at how much more something is somewhere else. For example, seafood processing, for example, in production is 3 times more locally than the use of it because it's exporting it. So a fish plant, jobs and buying fish and so on. Likewise with, for example, in fishing is not catching the fish that gives a big benefit, but selling it to the local plant, the spin-off. So in Newfoundland, there's a big debate going on, like, do we either replace, sort of things like fish plants getting removed from a community. I tell you right now, if you remove fish plants from fishing communities that are there might as well just have a seasonal place like you used to have on the Labrador. You have your summer community, you go out, you put your boat out, you fish, and you go, and that community disappears. I mean, that's the stark reality of it, sort of thing at this point in time. So that's the kind of stuff that we can sort of data mine out of our stuff. Eventually, our analysis tools will be on a web application for quick access. Like, for example, here is traveler accommodations. There are 61. They're all identified for the Bonavista Vista area, and Port Rixon, Trinity, and so on. It tells you, where they are, the highest concentration in Bonavista Vista, and then down here, and so on. We look at GDP and employment, and we have a time series. And you can look at the different changes over time and stuff like that. Very simple one. Another thing we did with David and some other things is looking at prototypes. And in this case, what we did, we look at labor force profiles for functional regions across Atlantic Canada. And you can compare regions, and you got fully integrated tutorials. And we're going to base this on our new web page that's coming up. But we relate demography to industrial structure. And you look at, sort of thing, the population structure of places plus the industries and stuff like that. And we can actually go in and break down, what do you need for the construction occupational breakdown, sort of thing. And then the trends over time. And, of course, when you get downturns and stuff like this. Secondly, we look at replacement capabilities locally, sort of thing. We look at the skill levels. We look at the occupation. And we look at the demography. And we look at what's coming in and what's going out. And what is your ability to replace this? Are you competitive in terms of wage attraction and stuff like this? And so that adds in information. So what do you need to do to attract, sort of thing. So at the end of the day, sort of thing, the idea going forward for us is that we want to keep this local information. Some people call it crowdsourcing, but we're a bit more precise in who we get the information from and who we employ. And we do a lot of training. Like I've actually met and trained local town clerks even to go out and say, take the survey, and then they say, can you teach me how to use Google Earth? Because they know where everything is. They can go and get the exact location. And I'm sort of one of my obsessive compulsive things is to look at where things are, because if we look at then town planning and you look at your distribution of your businesses and your services, you can look at where do I put the next thing that will complement what's already there. Okay? So basically, sort of thing. So basically, we feel that you need a sort of a comprehensive analysis for identifying contribution gaps and opportunities in local and regional economies. Our plan is to have web-based apps and so on that you can be updated. Like, for example, just to put things in context, is that we ran some models when the iron ore prices were going down for Lab City, and our model projected that the lag effect of job loss would be about 130 jobs, and actually 150 got laid off. But we were more than within the ballpark of saying this could be your potential impact given the downturn in commodity prices and stuff like this. And we're linked through some of our tools to tracking things that are going on, looking for keywords that may affect an economy as well. Through the web, if you will. So basically, our design and applications will be based on community partner participation and needs, and because otherwise it becomes another big white elephant or pink elephant stacked away somewhere that's not going to get used. And what we found over my experiences is that you've got to enforce ownership, and ownership is through engagement and meetings and trying to get people to participate. And that is happening, but some places are doing better than others, and there's resistance in some places. Like on the north tip of the Northern Peninsula, we have most of the north tip of the Great Northern Peninsula in Newfoundland, but there's 2 or 3 communities absolutely refuse to participate. But you know what we did anyway? We sent a student through there. We know where everything's located anyway for ourselves, sort of thing. Whether they want to be in it or not, they're going to be in it, because at the end of the day, it's just that we don't get, their participation, unfortunately, at this point in time. So anyway, thank you, and I think I'm only 1 minute over. Thank you.
Thank you. Our last speaker for this session is Dr. Herb Emery. He holds the Vaughan Chair in the Department of Economics at the University of New Brunswick, and he is going to talk to us this evening about universities as instruments of regional development in Canada's provinces. Please welcome Dr. Emery.
This is tomorrow's. Yes. You've got a station tomorrow as well, don't you? Let's see here. That is tomorrow's. I'll double check here. We might have it on here. There we go. Seems better.
Okay.
Excellent. Yep.
All right, I'm in luck. The audience still outnumbers the presenters, so we're off to a good start. Now, this is a tricky presentation to make because professors get upset when I tend to present it because the results aren't what they like. So what I want to point out is that this work is not questioning the value of universities. Universities are producing value. This is about where is the value captured, where is it booked. So we're going to look at the fact that we have these institutions that are operating in provinces, and we're going to look at the expenditure activity on them, the enrollments and things like that, and see if there's anything correlated with growth at the level of province, productivity, innovation, outcomes like that. We'll also do it at the level of CMA. And the way to think of this study is what we're thinking about is, are you a university on the periphery of a national system and a national labor market, or are you a university that's a core asset for a regional mission? And having worked out west for most of my career, I can tell you that most of the structures in Canada outside of this region are focused on making us part of the periphery of the University of Toronto or the University of British Columbia. And in fact, at one point, the big 5 universities had a proposal. They would be the only research universities in Canada. The rest of us would produce kids to feed into their programs. And in fact, they congratulated St. FX at staying primarily undergraduate and producing such good feedstock for their grad programs. So we need to think about that ecosystem and then ask ourselves, are we actually generating the benefit that we claim to provincial governments? So the simple research question we had is, do provinces experience higher GDP growth, labor productivity, and innovative activity by investing in their own universities? And this is a live question that we studied out west because the government of Alberta actually canceled its medical research fund, saying we can just free ride off of the rest of the world. The ideas are produced, we don't need to do our own. We did do a study of that, and we were correlating it with health outcomes, and we can show that local health research is associated with reduced avoidable mortality. But that was, again, a tricky study to do because economists went nuts. So economists attack anything that doesn't look like what they like. Nothing's causal. You're not allowed to say anything. The health people liked it, but then got confused at some point. We gave up on it. We do have a published version of it. It's just not in a journal. But we were trying to do this because this is an active discussion in most provinces. How much do we need to spend on these universities? So why don't we know the answer to this question? This was one of the troubling things. And the main answer is, if you look at something like the Naylor report on what to do with research funding in Canada, the discussion is always from benefits for the national economy, if not the global economy. It's never about what's happening at the level of province or level of city, even though most universities produce multiplier studies to say if you spend another $100 million on us, we're worth $8 gazillion to the local economy. None of it's validated, but the governments like those numbers. So we wanted to take a look at this because we know that in the national economy there's benefit because graduates are mobile across jobs, employers, industries, regions, nations, especially if you think about the pre-Brexit period now in Canada. We've got Wexit, which would really affect the Maritimes. So again, what we're trying to figure out west as part of an engaged university out there is, how do we pry more Atlantic Canadians out of this region and out west? We were trying to shut your communities down. So it's interesting to be in the room hearing about how you're trying to save them, because actively out west, there's another group that's saying, what if we just build a little village that looks like their hometown? Will they come out here then? And let's do it in Fort McMurray. They like oil. We'll give them oil. So universities in Canada have also increased their research intensity missions over time. They're attracting internationally recognized researchers, and they claim they're producing commercializable discoveries, but even though the evidence rarely shows that that's actually an impact in Canada. We have a weak record of commercialization. But there's less empirical evidence in Canada and the United States that universities drive the growth of the regional economy. And the benefits that are found by Goldstein and Drucker and Cantor and Wally, it tends to be a relatively modest impact, like not what you would even call one of the larger impacts. So when they get down to it, it's been really hard to demonstrate these benefits, even with pretty rigorous analysis like Cantor and Wally have a really nice instrumental variable approach where they look at changes in the value of university endowments as a proxy of research funding that's available, and that's an exogenous shock. And so people have done lots of great work. It's just really hard to find these benefits. So regional impact should matter for provincial taxpayers because that's who pays for most of the university. It's the students and the provincial taxpayer.
Smaller population provinces actually have less fiscal capacity to fund these universities and compete as they start to get more expensive. Newfoundland has the highest provincial spending per student in Canada by far. New Brunswick is second. And it's an order of magnitude, I think, now about $10,000 per student compared to Alberta. Some of this is picking up scale economies. Large universities can do things in a much more cost-effective way, but this is why we're starting to run into some issues around people questioning what are we getting out of the university. You also have a real demand right now. We don't need money in universities. That population is declining, the traditional demand, age groups that go. They're looking at how do we pay for long-term care. Why are we tying so much money up in, they're even looking at K to 12 now. How do we start to pry money out of education because we got to pay for health care? So the politics are driving this question saying, what's the value proposition of spending on universities? The other thing that's going on is that if all we're doing is exporting our young population, what's the point in subsidizing that? We're trying to keep people here, so if we want them less educated and immobile, you'll actually hear these arguments coming up and more. The universities are a human capital pump, and we'll come back to this. They were designed to be that. In a high unemployment situation when the baby boom was going through, universities were fantastic for getting rid of surplus population. Now we have a problem. We don't have a surplus anymore, but we're still pumping them out. We're really good at it. And now you're asking us to change, keep people around. Make up your minds. So the future is going to be more like the present, only much more expensive. These are the ratios of students per faculty member in universities in the different provinces. And what you see is that the Atlantic provinces, which are the lower lines which are turning down, they're headed back towards a ratio of students to faculty member of about 15 from reaching around 20. So in other words, what we've done to the system is we've had this transitory bulge go through. Now it's returning to an equilibrium that was actually there in the 1990s. And we could go back to 1990 and ask, if we knew this was coming, what would we have done differently? Would we have expanded this system the way we did? So out west, we don't have the same problem the rest of Canada. Those populations are growing. They still have rising enrollment per faculty member. They're hiring. Their faculty are young. But what do we have in our region? We have an aging professoriate. We have real increases in salaries for all ranks because we've tried to keep up with the rest of Canada. And what we have effectively is also falling research productivity with the career. So what we have in Atlantic Canada is increasingly expensive universities. And the comment this morning, how do you do more with less? I don't know the answer to that, but we're doing less with more. And so we have to sort of reconcile that politically, that there must be other ways of doing this or other ways of engaging with the stakeholders that are paying for most of this. And so one solution is just find more students, and I'll come to international student enrollment. But that's going to be a solution to try and make us look not so expensive. But again, the biggest challenge we have, why are grad students so critical to the research mission? Because we can't afford to hire professors. 30 years at the salaries we have, we've gone from being able to hire 2 or 3 down to hiring 1 for the same amount of money. When I started in 1993, I think the average salary in Canada was about $32,000 for a professor. Starting now, it's getting closer to 90 in a lot of provinces, even up into the low 100s. So in real terms, it's not quite 3 times, but what we're seeing is we're starting to eat our young just to preserve the salaries that we've got. And this is the big problem that university administrators deal with. But this ties in with where's the benefit for the region? What is the point in all the spending that we're doing? And these are the tough questions that we're going to be asked in the university once the budget crunch really starts to hit. Because if you go back to the 1990s, the first institutions hammered by provincial governments wasn't healthcare, it wasn't basic education, it was universities were first in line. And the size of the cuts we saw in the 1990s were 20% across the board in Alberta, where I was. I think they were high in Ontario. And Jason Kenney in Alberta has just announced 15% reductions over the next 3 years, and they're growing. So again, you have to start thinking through what's the value proposition of the universities. So are we associated with provincial economic performance, knowing that that's who's going to be deciding on our budgets, including things like how much are we allowed to raise tuition? Are we going to have a cap on it, or are we going to take that off? So what we did is we just took a lot of data, and I want to contrast this with the fantastic presentation that preceded mine with incredible detail and effort to get all that. I have a crappy little data set of about 120 observations. I tried to salvage it by finding more outcomes, but we used what was available. So we're looking at measures of GDP, labor force, employment, investment, population. We have university enrollments by province, by different fields. We're going to distinguish between engineering and everything else because there's a literature that says engineering has a different impact, in part because there's a different orientation of engineers towards local industry that may not be present, say, in humanities. If you know Shakespeare, you can go anywhere in the world where they care about Shakespeare. If you want to do something on hydraulic fracking, you're going to have some local knowledge about the technology. We've got university research funding by source from the Cabo FIUC data. We've even used that by the level of university so we could get to census metropolitan area. We've looked at size of university budgets. We've kept throwing stuff in because my students have been convinced by other people who have taught them if you don't get a statistically significant result, you fail. And so the problem was they kept adding stuff to see if they could find a significant result. It was better than a data miner in a computer program, just the paranoia of a student thinking they'll fail. We have 4 samples, all provinces, the 6 smaller population provinces, because the literature says you're more likely to find an effect where universities are large relative to the other knowledge infrastructure. We used the 4 large population provinces, greater than 1 million, and we did census metropolitan areas and census agglomerations to look even more locally. We shook the bag really hard. We've tried really hard to find effects, so I don't want to go through it all. We had lots of specifications. I've got reams of output. I don't have many results. So what we found in the end was, apart from faculties of engineering, universities do not have much measurable impact on the regional economy if you're using province or city. Engineering enrollment at the undergraduate level in particular was the correlation, not the research funding like NSERC. Now, this doesn't mean undergraduate students cause growth. What it means, I think, is that undergraduate enrollment is often a signal that you have growing demand for the program, which leads to more faculty positions. You get those juniors coming in who might be revamping curriculum, might be doing more research. So we're interpreting this more as just a sign of growth and activity in that particular faculty, which appears to have some correlation with the local economy that other areas don't. We were also able to show that this holds up when you look at the level of city, when you're looking at the level of university. And one thing, when we did look at engineering school curriculum, or what they're known for, is it's pretty heterogeneous across Canada. That you don't find that there's a single type of engineering school. You find that it really does start to look like, if you're out west, it's oil and gas. If you're going to be in Waterloo, it's going to be more around computer science and manufacturing, robotics. So it's much more specific than if I look at an economics department, I can tell you what textbooks they're often going to be using across the country. And it's because we're feeding students into a national labor market. That's what we do. Our students are going to go to Ottawa if they really make it and work for the federal government. If they don't quite make it that far, they'll get to a provincial government, but we need standard tools again. So overall, university budgets, research funding, the bulk of degree programs have no significant direct impact on the regional economy. We did have lots of lags in here, but short lags. These are short-term correlations. I'll come back to that as well. So, this is an interesting spin on having no significant results. Most people at this point would say, why did you present it? But I think it's a useful way to think through, are we surprised that there's nothing significant? So we've talked today about the importance of an engaged university. We heard, when are things necessary or sufficient to find an effect? And so I want to ask the question, are local provincial universities necessary for regional growth? Like, can you grow without one at the same rate? Are local provincial universities sufficient for regional growth? If I fund one of these things and keep resourcing it, is that going to drive more? So these are 2 questions we wanted to think about. So for necessary, do skills, knowledge, and ideas produced at the universities in the region have close substitutes that we can import from outside the region? So historically, Canada didn't do PhD programs. We sent our kids off around the globe, or we imported PhDs to come back and teach in our higher education institutions. So we didn't need to have PhD programs. At a certain point, we decided we wanted to have them. But that's a case of a close substitute. Now, a province can invest in its own universities, or it can free ride on the investments of others. So again, if you go to the Bologna Accord and the EU, there's an idea about just making kids transportable across borders. So that's a case where I could start to underinvest and just keep hiring the students coming out of other universities. I don't have to do this. So it comes down to a cost effectiveness decision. Is the local university better for getting me labor that I need than just trying to recruit from afar or using immigration? Are provincial capacities for education, training, and innovation more cost effective than imports? There's going to be market failures, positive externalities, which might tilt things in favor of having a local university. There might be things around just costs. Students can't get out of the province easily to get educated, and there's an advantage to doing that. We may see research universities have localized spillover benefits for the regional economy. So just by having professors tinkering, things start to spill over, splash out, and you get a startup. And there's a nice literature on who causes startups. Is it the students or the professors? What leads to more startups? That literature is even kind of unsettled, but we just kind of take it that if we have a university, they might start occurring. So where do the good ideas come from? So this is the generator of knowledge, the entrepreneurs and businesses. We'd be thinking about, are those market failures or spillover benefits big, and can we see those coming out? So far, we've only seen them through engineering in our results, not necessarily from anywhere else. We can raise the productivity of local non-university producers, and ideas are costly to import and apply in the region. So in this case, university may provide that capacity to take an innovation or idea from somewhere else and figure out how it works here. So in a resource sector, it's often you can find equipment that works in another place like Finland, but you don't know if it can cut trees in the terrain where you are, or you don't have the same kind of expertise for doing things quite the same way because you're still on your old growth forest, they're on their third generation of forest, which has nice spacing and everything else. So again, we need someone to figure out how to apply the ideas. Sufficient, are universities a large or at least influential contributor to the region's overall knowledge infrastructure? If there's lots of innovators around and lots of research parks that aren't university in the area, you may not be vital to it or you may not have a measurable impact because there's lots of other things going on. So this is a case where we have public and private institutions of knowledge production. We're looking at the capacities of firms, workers, and institutions for innovation and learning and the network of connections among them. Silicon Valley may not need universities to the same degree, although universities will say that's the reason there's a Silicon Valley. But over time, the cluster may outgrow the requirement of what comes out of the university itself. Now, in the Atlantic provinces, measures of R&D is gross expenditure on R&D, GERD, and business expenditure on R&D. In our region, we have low GERD and we have very low BIRD, which means we're going to be highly reliant on universities for our research and development. And so when you take a look at this, we also see a real emphasis that's going to come out on Dalhousie and Nova Scotia in particular is who the federal government likes. And so a lot of our region's R&D is actually going through things like the cluster, which are centered on Nova Scotia. So when we talk about we don't like picking winners, the federal government already has. And I just want to say they do have a sweet spot for Memorial and Newfoundland compared to New Brunswick. We are the most despised province when it comes to federal R&D. If we were funded on the same per capita basis as Nova Scotia, we would have $100 million more per year for R&D in New Brunswick. So these numbers start to matter because it's all we've got in the region. We don't have businesses doing this. So HERD is higher education R&D. And what you see there is that it's been growing over time because innovation was going to save the region. And what we know is that in the Atlantic provinces, we're highly dependent on higher education, university research R&D, and highly dependent on federal transfers of money. So again, when we look at this, we have to start taking a look at, we are an important part of the knowledge infrastructure. The money is coming in. The question is, why are we not seeing more impact? Is it because this money is actually supposed to be a complement and bring in the business R&D, in which case we need to do more of what we were learning about with the Irish example about how do you start working with companies? How do you leverage that money to come in and get the common purpose? Or are we treating this as a substitute for the business sector? We're using this money instead to replace what we can't do with business or what we don't want to do with business. Whatever we're doing, it's not working, so we might want to think about if we're trying to drive R&D and innovation, it's probably going to be looking at how we use this to leverage the complement, which is actually the cluster model that the federal government introduced with the super clusters. There had to be significant industry buy-in and funding, and there also had to be your university partners kind of explaining what they're going to add into the whole thing as well. So the bigger question is, are local university missions and activities oriented to the needs of the regional economy? And if they are, is it by accident or design? This room is full of great presentations today by people who are what we call the coalition of the willing. You have voluntarily stepped up and said, I want to make a difference. You're going about it, and you probably encountered your colleagues aren't always thrilled with what you do. And then when you say, I need an extra office, they go ballistic. They don't want you to have space or resources because that's not what real universities do. Are our teaching programs aligned with labor market needs? I was talking about this in Moncton yesterday. For which decade, which labor market? When did you refresh your curriculum? Have you actually looked at what students will do on the job when they graduate, or do you have your same syllabus from 20 years ago? And this has been an issue coming up as students are moving into things like data analytics. My former supervisor went to Amazon, has now built a master's program in data analytics to scale up that labor supply. What's the minimum information set a student needs to call themselves that? And it was really interesting to see you need 3 math courses, you need 1 basic computer science, and you need intermediate micro theory. That was it. Other than that, it's hands-on. And then the types of things it came down to is you ask, what are your students working with in a stats course? Is it Stata, which no one's going to use once they're out of there, or is it Excel or Python or something that they're actually going to see in the workplace? I'm useless. I don't know how to use Python, so I can't teach them that. I don't know R. So if you put me in that course, I'll use what I know, but is that preparing them for the workplace? I don't think so. We need younger faculty who come in who know this stuff, and then I'll drift off and teach the more policy-oriented courses where I'll just rant about the world. So universities are detached and conventional knowledge factories, and this is where we kind of abdicate responsibility for our downstream impact. What we do is we say, we've got great ideas coming out. Eventually, someone's going to find them. Eventually, they will be commercialized. We just have to keep doing our great ideas and publishing, and they'll be out there eventually. So the presence of a research-intensive university is taken as the benefit. Because who else does this long-term promise? If you do the right things, someday you'll have a payoff? The church. So Harry Johnson, an economist in the 1960s, made that same critique of university research in the 1960s in England, that if the only thing we could promise is some nondescript long-term payoff in the future, basically we're no different than the clergy and the other landed classes that don't have much else good to do. So the Knowledge Factory mission, though, I want to point out, was really good for regional adjustment. What the Knowledge Factory model did is it took kids out of the labor market to reduce the unemployment rate, but it also made them mobile. And no one complained about out-migration 25 years ago. It was sad because people went away, but it was also a relief. If you go back to the 1910s to 20s, they were kind of thrilled a little bit about World War I. It got rid of some of the surplus youth population that was agitating. In the 1930s, they started joking we could use another war. I think out-migration is a far saner way than a war to get rid of surplus population. But again, with regional adjustment, we had programs that were oriented to helping kids move on to the next province where they could find work. So now the problem we have is we're really good at it. We might be oriented towards that. How do we stop it and pivot something back to the local labor market? What do we actually need here as opposed to what does Toronto need? So if we then look at knowledge factories and education as an export, as we've been losing our own population of university-age kids, a lot of provinces and countries have been instead going to Southeast Asia where populations are growing, in Africa, and bringing in international students to backfill the spaces that aren't being occupied to show that universities are running full tilt. And you can see this is for all 4 Atlantic provinces. The blue lines are basically what we've been getting with our domestic young population across the 4 provinces. And the more colorful lines is just the band we've been bringing in with international students. New Brunswick has hardly any international students. Nova Scotia has basically been able to maintain its total enrollment by backfilling with international students. So everyone's excited saying, we just need to compete for global talent, bring in more international students, and all is good. No one has to change anything. The problem with this is that university human capital exports differ from other goods and services. If all we're doing is exporting human capital, we bring in the feedstock from somewhere else, we run them through our courses, then we send them on their way. The benefits are captured wherever they're employed ultimately. That's where their GDP is booked. So what are we doing in the short run is we're taking revenues from tuition and mandatory fees, and that's all we're getting. We're not getting tax revenue down the road. We're not getting any of the realized benefit. So the push right now in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia is, can we keep some of these students? When they graduate, do they have to go away or can we keep them? And the federal government says, well, we'll think about it. but they've made it very difficult for our international students to stay. And unfortunately, where are they going? They're going to Toronto, and then Toronto complains every time we allow you to take more international students, they show up here, and it's because we actually have programs that won't let them stay in Atlantic Canada easily. Toronto, for a master's graduate, or Ontario, if you go to an Ontario university, get a master's degree, you can become a permanent resident with no work experience. New Brunswick, where there's no jobs, you need at least 1 year continuous work experience to get permanent residency. So when my students told me that, I wasn't even aware of it. No wonder we lose everyone. They apply for jobs, nothing happens. They go to Toronto, they go to Halifax, and they're gone. So if we're going to do this, we want to think about what we're trying to get out of it, because the taxpayer is subsidizing this enterprise as well. It's a heavily subsidized export industry, corporate welfare on a scale that we don't probably want to calculate. So finally, what about the spending multiplier? There's an expectation that if we just spend on universities, it will increase GDP. The pushback on this is, what's different about spending on a university than spending on a highway or spending on healthcare or anything else government can spend on? What do we have in terms of a higher multiplier? So there's an older literature that argued that the local multiplier of a university is actually less than other uses because we have high leakages. Think international conferences, think holiday homes somewhere else. The income professors earn or the research grants aren't always being used in the local economy, they're being used elsewhere. Universities don't operate through the summer at full tilt. So again, compared to a healthcare system that might, you might see more bang for your buck if the money was diverted elsewhere from that one. The other cases, Cantor and Wally, show that there is this spillover effect, which might lead to a suggestion that the local multiplier is actually larger than other uses of G. But again, what we want to look at is which activities in the university are generating these spillover benefits that would predict a higher multiplier effect. So again, when we do want to do this, we're going to increasingly be asked to justify which multiplier are we using, why is it that value, and why is your multiplier higher than any other use. And this is coming in even things with the, what does ITB stand for again? ITB credits? Industry Transfer Benefit. When you have defense procurement spending, they have different multipliers attached. They give university research a multiplier of 5. For every dollar given to a university for R&D, it counts towards $5 of spending that the company has to do for its obligations for the contract. If they just buy a widget from a local company, that only counts dollar for dollar. And so these multipliers can be quite large in some of these calculations. Now, is the lack of a measurable correlation of university research and teaching activities a regional economic performance a problem? Answer 1, no. University outputs have long gestation periods before they have economic and social impacts. My study misses all these because I could only do short-run correlations. So the Naylor panel that we had federally would tell me I'd wasted my time because you got to give these things 10, 20, 30 years and then they'll start to show up. And I think in the report they talk about things like how long it took insulin to sort of filter through the system. If we're going back to insulin as our big impact, I think that's been almost a century. We need something more recent. The other one is, no, it's not a problem. The lack of correlation actually shows we're doing what we're supposed to do, which is advancing knowledge rather than addressing local societal needs. So the inutility of universities is actually a sign that we're doing the right thing. And that Stanley Fish in this provocative book, Save the World on Your Own Time, he has this line, universities argue from weakness when they say, see what we can do, see what we do in fact contributes to the state's prosperity or to the community's cultural life or the production of a skilled workforce. That's failure for a university. So this is the mindset inside the ivory tower, that this is not what we should be doing. So then the third one is no, Canada's Advisory Panel on Federal Support for Fundamental Research. We're doing too much applied science in Canada anyway. It's time to get back to basic research. Why? Because this is about for Canada. Research funding is about Canadian and national goals, not regional needs or regional interests. And that's going to be served by basic science with long gestational periods. That was the punchline of the Naylor panel report. It's widely supported in most of Canada that this is what we need to be doing. So when we're coming here with a great conference, which I agree with everything in here, the bigger battle we have is that it isn't necessarily the case that universities are being incented to think that way, because most of the federal money that we depend on is not for the things we want to worry about. It's feeding into this national mission. And so when you have a royal commission that comes up with that, by the former president of the University of Toronto, we have to pay attention to that. So could universities do more to address provincial economic growth? I think the answer to that is definitely yes, but we have to decide we want to do it, and it's probably going to require some purposeful discussion about what is the mission and what's the balance between the passive knowledge factory and the engaged university. And the punchline I'll finish with is my former president at UNB was formerly an administrator at Memorial, and he took your engaged university idea and he came and he said, what if we were the university for New Brunswick instead of the University of New Brunswick? And lately I wanted to tell him we've seemed to be evolving into the University in New Brunswick. So if you really want to be horrified, there's something out there called the slow movement in academia, and that's a postmodernist approach that we must reject neoliberalism and human capital missions, and you must reject the teaching and research work that's being imposed on you and self-actualize. So if we're going to spend billions on self-actualizing professors, I don't look forward to that discussion in the halls of the legislatures. I don't think we're going to do well. So what I'm really hoping with conferences like this one is that we do start to figure out how we can communicate to our colleagues how this can complement what they want to do in the wider university mission, and that it's not about all or one, it's about how do we get the balance and how do we make the most of all the assets that are around. So I'll finish with that because I know it's a long day and I probably went over time as well, but thanks for your attention.
We're going to take 3 questions before we finish up. Just before we, if Ray and Alvin could come up there for a second, please. I just want to make sure that you understand there's a banquet at 7 o'clock tonight, and it's here, it's in this room. It's a very important speaker, and he's talking about some really important issues. And I would encourage you to stay. I can appreciate it's been a long day, and I will now give you the opportunity to, and tomorrow morning we will have someone talking about the benefit of universities in terms of what it means for labor markets, but we'll deal with that tomorrow morning. Any questions? Okay. Just hold on. Here.
Herb, hi, how are you? John Casey here from Waterford Institute of Technology. Thanks for the provocative talk. I thought it was very interesting. I've 1 or 2 questions, I suppose. First up, does every province in Canada have a university? You know, is there any province without one? In other words, as kind of an alternative?
The interesting thing is the only institution that distinguishes a province from a territory is the university. So every province has one, including Prince Edward Island, which is only 150,000 population. New Brunswick, I think we have 7 universities for 750,000. I think Nova Scotia's got 10 to 14. You go to Ontario, you're going to get up to 20 or 30 the way they've been doing them. We're actually creating more universities over time across Canada. So we've taken colleges and we've elevated them up to universities. We've taken them from teaching, we've elevated them to research institutions. So the answer is yes, every province has one, and they're growing in number and size in most places.
So we don't know what the world looks like without a university, because I suppose my talk tomorrow will be looking at what happens if you don't invest in an institution like a university, or don't fully invest in one.
So there is a literature on decommissioning universities,
Yeah.
And getting rid of them when they do go insolvent. They haven't tended to happen in publicly funded universities, but you do see amalgamations, you do see mergers, you do see attempts to move them in together. So different corporate structures. The closest we have are large budget shocks, like in the 1990s, where you can look at what happened when you contracted the budget 20%. Now, it's not a clean experiment because it's kind of like when you feel sorry for the bad guys and you tell them, we're going to arrest you tomorrow, you better get out of town. What we saw out west was the universities inflated their budgets for the 3 years prior to the cut. And then when it hit, they were cut back to what they would have had normally. And it was really interesting to see how universities save. They do it with non-essential positions that get resourced at high salary. And those things just get cut, but nothing changed in terms of the frontline budget. The mistake I made in my career was I was doing that before tenure, studying my own institution, and the finance VP just kept saying I didn't know how to read a budget. And suggesting I should cease and desist from the study, but the only thing we really have are budget shocks to look at. And some of them, like the Cantor and Wally one, might be the most interesting to look at, where they used university endowments as that proxy.
Thank you.
Ray, I'll start with you. You were talking about the number of dump trucks that are going through a community in a day. In a 10-hour shift, you're talking about 590 dump trucks going through a community. I'm just wondering, with the project that you're looking at, can you create another road to the wells that are away from the communities, or can you use the ocean as a route?
I mean, yes, you'd have to make some investments in public infrastructure or infrastructure associated with the development. But, you know, wherever you enter that peninsula, you still have to move, you know, large volumes of water, sand, and chemicals around. So even if you move the port from Stephenville onto the Port-au-Port Peninsula and avoid the isthmus, you still are moving a lot of trucks around, and it'd still be disruptive. And the point is, you know, at what point is it acceptably disruptive? You know, if you can reduce it by a factor of 10, you know, rather than 1 a minute, it's 1 every 6 minutes. Is that okay?
Thank you very much. First of all, I wanted to say I do think that academics are like Kronos eating their children. I think you're right on that. But the question actually I had is, can't the university generate both the ivory tower goals and the pragmatic concerns? And so when you're trying to quantify things, I was thinking of NASA or, you know, IBM's projects for Watson or to beat chess players, Garry Kasparov. They seem to have these, not intrinsic, that's not the word, intangible goods that they produce. So if you ask a lot of engineers why they became engineers, they might say they were inspired by, you know, the space race or something like that. And so there's a lot of things that you can't quantify. And so when you're trying to look in the community for, you know, what goods are produced, there's a lot of things you're going to miss. And those might be really important things and drivers for the whole industry.
That's a fair point, but again, goes back to when you create these ideas and intellectual property, where are they being commercialized, where are they being booked? And what we're seeing is a lot of great ideas are just being sold. So the intellectual property is our export as opposed to the knowledge and products that are created from the intellectual property. So the startup economy in Atlantic Canada is actually an exit economy, that we're not set up to scale, or we're not set up to become industries, but we do a lot of push on the initial R&D so that we can sell off those little companies and the patents and things like that. So the real challenge that I think is coming in increasingly is, how do you do the next stage so that you can scale up some of these companies that are coming online and keep them here? And again, it's even with your incumbent companies that are here, they're working with universities in other regions and they're expanding in other places. So how do we make that expansion occur here instead of somewhere else? And that's where you have to start getting into the government has to sort of help the university do that. But you'll start to see that they think they're missing an office on commercialization, but they don't look at their corporate tax structure or the legal regulatory environment. So again, I think you can do more. At the moment, I can just say, looking at the simple statistics, there's no evidence that we are doing as much as we think in terms of that direct economic benefit, but we know the value is being created, and we even lose professors who get great publications and things to other places. Like when you start to see the movement of your superstars, where they go, the biggest challenge for a university trying to keep them is, can you pay a $700,000 a year salary like University of Calgary and University of Alberta are paying? Do you even have a collective agreement that would allow that? So the arms race for top talent in universities, if you want to play in that pool, gets pretty tough. And then in a lot of cases, you've hired them past their prime anyway, so you're looking at what did you buy? But the only thing I'd say is the discussion we should be having is universities don't have to be one thing, but we've turned into that. If you increasingly look at what do we value, it's publications, it's grant money. It's a very traditional mission, you would call it, but if you go back 50 years, that wasn't the traditional mission. The complaint then was we didn't do enough science, we did too much applied work and consulting with government. We were too engaged. Now we've gone the other way, we're not engaged enough, so how do you swing the pendulum back would be my main argument.
So Ray's going to respond. Claire will have a short question as well.
It's not so much a response, but when Herb was giving his presentation, so I've worn two hats at Memorial. One is in the Vice President's office, and the other is Dean of Engineering. So I was somewhat depressed by part of it, but then kind of you did a big save there on the end with the engineering comment. But in seriousness, though, I think engineering in general in a university, I experience it. I'm on the Canadian Accreditation Board. I visit universities regularly. Engineers in general are pretty comfortable with this ambiguous dual role we play. I mean, we do publish. We're published in top journals, but dissemination in other ways is actually valued. So, the spin-off of a company or the impact on a process is as valuable as, a publication. It's not as if it's, one or the other. Typically, engineering faculty have some combination of both. It's not only engineering. I mean, in our own economics department, you kind of see sense of this, engagement and a balance. Faculty music seems to balance between, performers who are practitioners and, people who are engaged in theory and historical, more conventional, history. The place where I really found it shocking when I was leading a process to develop a research strategy for Memorial was actually faculties of business, where you go into a faculty of business, which I would have thought was similarly applied and kind of had this balance like I kind of experienced in my own career. And to find that, in subsets of business, there's like 5 journals that matter. It's not just publication. It's actually 5 journals that matter. And if you're not in that, you're just wasting your time. And so, when one of your slides, Herb, you had on, entrepreneurship, business, and I forget what the first, where are business faculties in terms of the entrepreneurship and business output? The company Verifin that I referred to with my graduate students, that started off as an experiment with 3 engineering undergraduates paired up with 3 MBA students. 20 years later, the 3 engineers are the ones who carried that company. The MBAs went all off and worked for banks. These were the ones who were in entrepreneurship programs. Right? Memorial does really well on entrepreneurship competitions at the undergraduate level, but it doesn't seem to translate into entrepreneurs. And I think it's something about business schools, at least in my experience.
Alton, you have a short question?
Yes, I'm going to throw this towards Alvin. Actually, I could have whispered this in your ear while you were sitting here, Alvin, but I thought that it would... What's that? What did you say? No, it's totally professional, totally professional. No, I thought just one comment and a question, and the reason I didn't whisper it in his ear because I think it's relevant to the discussions here today. And first of all, I want to congratulate you on the work that you've done. I've been following it, as you know, for at least 25 years. And what you've done is you've kind of created a form of magic here that fulfills some of our analytical dreams that we had back 25 years ago. But the difference that you've done here is, the magic is based on data with lots of math and lots of statistics, which gives it a good, solid scientific basis. And I'm familiar with these areas, and I work with people all over. And I don't know of anybody who's taken this as far as you have. The closest that I've seen, which is not an economic model, but Statistics Canada with their social policy simulation database model, is the same kind of a thing, but from a different angle. And this is not easy stuff to do. It takes the right smarts. You got to be crazy to do it and stay at it for so long. So congratulations. It's great to see it come this far. And the question, and the reason I asked this question is because in as much as the work that you've done is not something that is done every day, everywhere by any means, I think I thought it would be interesting for you to see what you think in terms of how much progress you've made in terms of local communities being able to use this. And now that you've got all this experience with the tool, what are the interactions between you guys and the communities to make this really worthwhile?
Well, to quote something, it's a tale of 2 cities, really, at the end of the day. Just give some examples in the current project, we're looking at community clusters. And for 90% of the participants, we're getting a really good cooperation and so on. And some people are now, some communities are refusing to participate for some reason or another, which we'll get to the bottom of eventually. But what I found is that it is a long road, and it doesn't happen overnight. And basically, as you know, we started this stuff back a couple of years ago. And there has been a culture change because if you note, 25 years ago, if you asked communities to form a cluster or a group and put in a proposal about what are their concerns and what are their ambitions or whatever, I mean, it would never happen. I mean, I remember being in some communities where someone said, well, I'm in St. Mary's Bay and you're on this side, there's no bloody way that I'm coming across that divide, you know, sort of thing. And actually, it has changed quite a bit because now they realize without that collaboration and participation, you know, you won't be here in 20 years. And that is a thing that I think that's amazes me that we don't see in the public discussion. All the issues around the fishery, issues around communities where the median age is like 60 odd years of age, you know, sort of thing, that there are places that, you know, as David Frischwater said, you got to manage for growth, and that's a whole different type of policy and model. Areas that are stable and holding their own, that's a whole nother thing. But then again, there is something about managing decline, you know, sort of thing, and neither one is really happening in a concerted effort. And that concerns me because basically people are left out to deal with it on their own, and we're trying to intervene in some way and work with them. And just put a case in point, the community I was born in is no longer existing. The community I grew up in was 593 people in the 1970s. Now they're down to 136. And I can tell you what's left there, they are the non-mobile aging population that's going to go nowhere, and they're probably, that community will eventually either move across the bay to another one, or they'll all just eventually go to that greater glory, as they say, you know, sort of thing. But it is a battle. But one thing we do notice is that if you go into a room now, there is discussion about regionalization, sharing services. And we did a piece of work actually for the Rural Secretariat one time, what makes a place livable? And basically at the end of the day, when we look at, we went to every region in the province when we worked on that thing. And what we found was what people want, they don't want MRI machines. They want some primary health care. They want to have a school if they got kids. They're convinced they can deal with mobile services. So this idea of fixed assets and all this other thing is sort of a bit antiquated, you know, sort of thing and stuff like this. So there is a culture evolving, but you know, is not to where you want it to be, you know, sort of thing. And I think there's still a lot of work to do. And I think the big issue is there is a fear out there in some communities because, believe it or not, when we proposed to do a certain study a certain way, I was told by one bureaucrat, oh, they'll never catch on to that. But you know what? The local communities came out in spades and they did the job. And they actually gave good information and well-structured information. So basically, let's not underestimate what's there at the local level. And actually, there's a new generation moving in, although there's some older ones still hanging on. But the attitude of that we need to regionalize in some fashion or another in terms of service and development in order for us to sustain ourselves in the long term. But they know there's going to be winners and losers. And I can tell you right now in this province, I can name, probably off the top of my head, about 100 communities that are in demographic stress, as we would call it. There's no chance of recovery through natural process. There's no in-migration for the last 30, 40 years, so you figure that one out. You know, when you drop by a few 100% of your population, and there's no young people, there's some obvious things. And I think that people are starting to realize that this is happening, but you know, as anything, like sometimes the truth hurts, and sometimes they start participating because that's their only last hope. But sometimes you got to say, look, I was in a meeting recently where someone said, well, what do you think about our situation? Well, I said, unless you can find 200 people to bring in your community tomorrow, there is no recovery in terms of population. And that's the stage it's gotten, you know, in many small rural areas. You know, anyways.
Okay, let me be clear here. Short preamble.
Right.
Short question.
Right. By the way,
I didn't make that clear before.
when a criticism of CARE that you've only organized a lackadaisical 13-hour conference day today. We could have gone till midnight, I'm sure. But my comment, maybe question is for Herb. 3 wonderful presentations, by the way, guys. Thank you very much. Herb, we tend to measure what's easy to measure, and not that what you measured was all that easy. I mean, there's some challenges, but I wonder if there's some things that are really difficult, if not impossible to measure, that would really bring the importance of the university. So for example, we know that under the determinants of health, education is one of the things that makes you live happier and longer. But you know, how do you measure that? And so a university would play a really important role in achieving that objective. So I'm wondering if the perspective that you bring, it might only be maybe a very narrow perspective on the values of post-secondary.
Oh, it's definitely narrow. And the fact is, I do think universities are more oriented towards the local social needs, much more than the economic. And that's actually a criticism of universities lately, that the institution is hostile to business. But when you look at health faculties in particular, there's lots of outreach into local communities, vulnerable populations. And like I said before, we did do this with avoidable mortality and health research. And you can show that universities investing in medical research, health research, are correlated with big declines in avoidable mortality. And we think that when we looked at it, it had nothing to do with the actual research being done, but those professors and researchers are the ones that are bringing ideas in and introducing them to the local population. And in medicine, they actually have a result in the literature that shows ideas travel 50 kilometers. So that's how local the transmission is. And so if you don't have that receptive capacity in your province, you're not going to bring in the best practices from somewhere else. But we were looking at the economic benefit for when they come looking for, we need to reduce our tax rate, or we're tired of spending, show us your GDP impact. The problem you run into is when you go back and you say we're vital for the social fabric of the community, when budgets get tight, governments don't seem to worry about the community so much anymore. And that's what we've been worried about with the fiscal problems for the last 10, 20 years, is during good times, everyone spent like bandits instead of trying to keep some of their powder dry. And now the problem is the things we care about are at risk. So you heard when university budgets got tight, they went after the center that was doing the occupational health and safety. They didn't go after the low enrollment programs that the students aren't taking anymore, that wasn't having that benefit. So again, what we worry about is that if we're the expendable luxury doing the engagement piece and making that difference in the community, we're also the most expendable from the perspective of the traditional mission of the university. And so this is where I think you have to think about what's our purposeful mission if we really do want to make that difference. And I agree it's totally narrow to look at the economic outcomes, and I think it's actually easier to show the benefits on the social dimensions. And again, it's because there's a different type of researcher that's often working in that field, even the more clinically minded people who tend to go out and work with people, as opposed to economists like me who are more inclined to shut my office door and work on something in a statistics package. I could have spent most of my career just in a closed office and I would have lived happily ever after. This getting out stuff is rough. Thank you.